everybody to a tasting of winter warmers. So we have 3 reds here. When one thinks of winter warmers, I suppose you could think of fortified wine, but we've ruled that out tonight, and we have here 3 table red wines, a very interesting little array. I suppose when you think of winter warmers, it's some wine that will accompany rich food dishes, and that means reds that are not only intense, but very big and full-bodied. And to a certain extent, they, I guess, have going with that higher alcohol than you would normally have on red wines. And sometimes also that means there's quite a lot of tannin extraction on the wine. And in the wines we're going to taste in a moment, they're very much what we're going to see. These are wines, I suppose, that you wouldn't enjoy so much in the hot weather. I suppose if they were chilled and so on, they'd be okay. It's just something about your mood, isn't it, when you're talking how cold it is in the weather and so on. I'm in Brisbane tonight, and it's pretty cold outside already, and it was freezing this morning. So these wines look pretty good to me at the moment for the circumstances we're in. Some of you are in locked down by COVID, so any good wine looks extra good, I suppose. So to our first wine, which is it's an Argentinian Malbec. And Argentina is famous for Malbec. Malbec's a variety that originates in southwest France, but there's not a lot of it there anymore. And Malbec has a reputation for a very dark colour and a very rich, somewhat soft, plummy sort of flavour. And it can be a marvellous blending wine. And to a certain extent, there's pockets of it still in Bordeaux where it is used as a blender. But the Argentinians have got hold of it and made it, sort of almost their national red variety, where they make wines 100% of Malbec. The best area for it seems to be their more mountainous, high altitude areas. And the really famous part of Argentina for that kind of climate is a district called Mendoza, which is pretty well known all around the world. There's for various reasons, there's actually a very famous Chardonnay clone, which is called the Mendoza clone. I'm not sure what its link to Argentina is, but Mendoza is a pretty famous wine region. So here we have Mendoza Malbec, and it's a wine that you do see in Australia, and it does have a following. Even though Australia makes big reds, it has a following. You'll notice the very dark colour straight away, and it's a lovely deep crimson colour too. And when you hold it up and tilt it over, you can see a really attractive colour to it. On the aroma, it's got a real sweet plum and fruitcake, fruitcake Christmas, almost Christmas pudding sort of richness to it. And to taste it, it is big. It's got a lot of weight. There is a slightly hot feel to it, meaning the alcohol. But overall, it's quite a velvety, smooth, fleshy wine with this quite big flavour. And straight away you could see how it would match up particularly well with some pretty rich food. It's 13.5% alcohol, it says, which for a big red is, I guess, not that high. So many Australian bigger reds are 14, maybe 14.5, and at 13.5, that's weighing in as being, not that alcoholic. What's our big clue for overall assessment of quality? Well, it smells pretty good, and it smells like very attractive red wine. It's that persistence thing. So you have to take a sip and swallow it. If you're judging, you'd have to spit it out, but swallow it. And how long can you feel it for? And what is the shape that it leaves behind in your mouth, on your palate? Is it a pleasing shape? It's just fading now for me, and it fades off pretty softly. It's got some medium persistence. So I think it's pretty good, not great, but pretty good. And I think it'd be a crowd pleaser. Rich, round, soft, inoffensive, not especially tannic. So Malbec is not a very tannic variety. It mainly has a rich middle palate and big colour, and it's very aromatic normally. So that fruit cakey, plummy aroma is what it's famous for, and that's why it's so good in a blend. But given the reputation of Argentinian Malbec, I find that wine to be actually reasonably elegant, quite an elegant red, and not too big at all. Big enough, but not huge. So very, very pleasant indeed. On to our second wine, and I put these in an order where we're sort of climbing up the scale of fullness of the flavour of the wine. And this is a small producer in the Barossa Valley, and they called it Tomfoolery, black and blue Shiraz, and it's 2020 vintage, so it's pretty young. And well, we'll talk about the alcohol in a moment after we taste it. But there's a little bit of a background story about these sorts of wines from the Barossa Valley, but let's taste it first. So again, pretty attractive colour, very crimson. I mean, it's lovely on young reds to see such a vibrant crimson sort of character. No traces of any of that sort of bricky red, copper sort of brownness. And the aroma is very raspberry. There's a real lifted, almost like raspberries that you buy, fresh raspberries. There's quite a raspberry fruit aroma there. And raspberry is one of the classical descriptors of young Shiraz. So that fits. And to taste it, quite rich, round, quite big, very, viscous and juicy in the mid palate. It's fading away about now. So probably not quite the persistence of the Argentinian Malbec, but nonetheless, it's got some nice persistence. It certainly has the remnant flavour as it fades away. The so-called finish of the wine is quite a soft, clean finish, which in itself is a very nice thing to have. So it's got its big, juicy raspberry aroma is kind of bigger than its palate, if you know what I mean. The palate is softer than you'd think. Interestingly, on that wine, I don't really notice the alcohol particularly. Normally, if you have high alcohol out of balance, there's a slightly hot burning feel, as if someone's tipped some spirit into the wine, which you don't see. But you'll notice when you put the glass down, how the wine's sliding down the sides of the glass, which is the alcohol viscosity and the glycerin that's in the wine, the so-called legs. The only time you'd ever make any reference to that effect is when you're noting that you've got quite a high alcohol wine. So seeing that and then noting the aroma and the palate, you don't particularly smell high alcohol, because often high alcohol reds can often be not so fruity as this. They can actually lean a little bit into that stewed fruits and figs kind of aroma. This one's got quite a nice fresh raspberry aroma, but on the palate, you don't really taste the alcohol. So it's done pretty well, I think, and it's all quite harmonized within itself. It's pretty soft drinking. A lot of people will be horrified that we're drinking 2020 big Barossa Shiraz, but I think it's presenting pretty well. And one of the things about high alcohol soft reds is they normally, well, in my view, don't age particularly well, because the very thing about that wine is its liveliness and the lovely, fresh, lively raspberry aroma. And if that wine ages for a year or two, it'll start to lose that. It'll pick up some other flavors, but that very vibrant raspberry aroma, I think, is pretty attractive. When I read the back label, the wine has an alcohol content of 15%, so that's up there. That's high, but you don't taste it. You don't notice it. There's the back label's very well written and pretty good marketing effort and lots of interesting poetry and bits and pieces. But You'll notice about the forefathers, he mentions the forefathers there. What is happening, what has happened a lot in the Barossa Valley, and we've talked about this in some of the previous tastings, is that there was a pattern that went on in the Barossa Valley from when the area was first established back in the sort of 1830s, that there were substantial growers who, up until quite recently, grew fabulous grapes on old vines and sold most of or all of their crop. Now, a lot of the crop was pre-purchased, and to this day, the likes of Penfolds and Orlando and other big producers have growing contracts with growers, and they specify the quality level that they expect, and they pay accordingly. And when you specify quality level, that means you've got to have the yields have to be kept pretty low. You've got to have a certain degree of ripeness and so on. And so a lot of the Barossa producers, if you ever went there, would boast and say, half of my vineyard is graded Penfolds A class, meaning it goes into Grange or St. Henri or 389. And then, B class might go into Canunga Hill and Kalimna, and so it goes. And that was a pretty common story until about, I suppose, starting 10 years ago. And what would happen would be that the son or the daughter, sometimes the grandson or granddaughter, would go off and do wine science at Adelaide University and come back and take the whole thing over from granddad or dad, and they'd start keeping some of the grapes back. They'd still sell because they need the money, but they'd keep a portion back and they'd make a wine themselves. Or maybe they'd give all the produce to a producer, but they would get some of the wine made by that producer and back to them in the form of a clean skin, which they then put their own label on. And so you're getting these young producers in the Barossa Valley that have got this fantastic resource. Sometimes the vines go back over 100 years, and they decide to do things their way on their batch of grapes. And invariably, those young producers believe in not as much oak, in fact, not much oak at all, and making a lighter, spicier, fruitier style. And often they refer to Shiraz on the back label, and they're doing something different to the very traditionally held taste of, a very, the very elegant but very oaky style of the Barossa Valley. So, if you've tasted recently some producers such as Penfolds and Elderton, particularly, and Rockford, particularly Rockford Basket Press, and Torbreck's another one. They're producers that are still forging on with a lot of oak and pretty high alcohol, and they make a very powerful wine. Yes, Ken's just mentioned there the Z wine. There are a number of these small producers. I think the Z people are two daughters, actually, who kept some back, and they've gone completely away from what Dad used to do by making these sort of elegant, under-oaked, lower alcohol wines. And some of them are having some pretty good success, and they're concentrating, they're getting quite a, I wouldn't say a Rhone-like quality, but they're nonetheless getting a pretty spicy, interesting, red-berried, fruit-dominant background oak style Shiraz. And there's quite a number of them. Kaleski is probably best known, but there are a number of others that are doing it, and it's worth sort of looking. There's another one that's fantastic, which is called Seabrook. Hamish Seabrook is the youngish guy, and his family have vineyards, and his wife's family had vineyards, which they've now inherited and they've amalgamated, and they've actually got a pretty substantial holding in the Barossa Valley of very old vines, just near the road that goes up to Eden Valley out of the Barossa floor. They're just in that sort of northeast corner of the Barossa Valley. So they're another great example of this movement. Some of those artisans of the Barossa who've taken over dad or granddad's vineyard and been making wine, nonetheless have not gone too far into the under-oaked and Syrah route. They've stayed with the quite big, should I say, Robert Parker style. Robert Parker being that American critic who likes very big, very big forward, high-toned, oaky reds. And some of them are still staying in that area and doing pretty well for themselves with some artisan wine, which is from particularly old vines and with very intense flavors, and maybe keeping the oak a little bit on the background. So that's what this particular guy is doing. So their back label sort of explains that. Cherished Barossa Shiraz, hand-picked, open fermented, so very traditional. Basket press, which is basically the ancient Roman technique of making wine. Non-interventionist approach, and just reflect the individual characteristics of the vineyard and the variety. And that's another particular thing that a lot of these young artisans are doing in the Barossa Valley, and I find all that sort of thing really interesting. And to taste the wines of Penfolds and Elderton and the others I mentioned is good fun as well. But to see these new changes coming along in the Barossa Valley, which has been such a traditional area, is a really good thing to see. So that's the base. That's the sort of story about that second wine. And most importantly for that, it's a big juicy Shiraz, but you don't see the alcohol that's on it. Yes. So to explain Frederick's query there, where they say non-interventionist, there are a range of processes of winemaking that a winemaker can choose. So, for example, you can make some decisions right back at the time of growing the grapes that season in the vineyard. You can prune a certain way. You can leaf pluck late in autumn to get the sunlight to give you extra ripening. You can deliberately wait till the grapes are starting to just turn into little prunes on the vineyard, then pick them. And that gives you that incredibly intense flavor, but you do get a dried figs aroma. So you see that a bit on Torbeck, actually more than a bit actually, but anyway, that's just a style, and some people love that style. Once the grapes are picked, there are also decisions to be made then. You can do cold soak. Normally with Barossa Shiraz, you wouldn't have to worry too much about that. You can ferment it with cooling. So you ferment in stainless steel tanks with those cooling jackets where you keep the fermentation cool. The yeast, when they do fermentation, produce heat. So if you don't cool it, the fermentation actually lifts in temperature quite dramatically. And the warmer the ferment, the more extraction and tannin you get, but the less fruitiness. Whereas if you keep the ferment cool, you retain more fruity esters in the wine, but you don't get as much tannin and extract, and your colour's not quite as good. So there are sort of decisions to make as to where you're going to fit there. Once fermentation is over, and there's another big choice too. With the fermentation, do you put a cultured yeast and add it, a laboratory yeast, or do you let the natural yeast that have come in on the grapes from the vineyard do the fermentation? Normally, indigenous yeasts give you a much silkier mouthfeel, but they're not as strong as the cultured yeast. So that means as the alcohol builds up, now if you know you've picked pretty ripe and you know you potentially can achieve 15% alcohol, you know your yeasts are going to have to be pretty strong. Now, if you've been doing this for some years, your yeast from last year will still be hanging around. They'll be living in the equipment and they're probably in the vineyard and whatever. So you're going to have a confidence level. But if you have a difficult year, the natural yeast may not finish off the fermentation. So your fermentation will stall at maybe 13%. And that means there'll be 2% sugar. And the wine will taste too sweet. So there are various techniques to try and get the yeast to finish off. You can warm the ferment a bit at the end. You can feed the yeasts. You can actually add nitrogen and actually feed them and make them go strong at the end. Or you can actually add a bit of cultured yeast halfway through so that the cultured yeast takes over from the indigenous yeast and finishes off the fermentation. Once the fermentation's over, you've got more decisions to make. You can settle the wine. You can filter it if you wanted to. You can put it into oak barrels as a really clean wine, or you can put it into barrels with all the bits of solid and all the dead yeast lees. You can actually finish the fermentation in barrels if you want to, and that means that the dead yeast lees will go to the bottom of the barrel and you have a scum on the bottom of the barrel, and then you can rotate the barrels around to coat the inside of the barrel with the yeast lees. And that means that only the soft bits of the oak flavour come into the wine because the coating of the lees acts as a sort of a membrane. And then you can decide new oak, 1-year-old oak, 2-year-old oak, 3-year-old oak, old oak. Do you have a French or American? Do you leave it in oak for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whatever you like to do? So in the case of, say, Torbreck and Elderton and Penfolds, they're talking about 18 months in oak, probably 20 to 25% typically is new oak. It's a mixture of French and American. If it's Grange, it's all American and it's all 100% new. If it's 389, it's the American oak barrels from last year's Grange vintage. So the effect of the American oak is very strong. So you get a huge flavour on it. So you can see all these processes that are taking place where the winemaker can intervene and can do things to get to actually produce a style of wine that they are seeking, because that's what they believe consumers want. So there's no question that Penfolds are pretty interventionist. Torbreck are very interventionist. So they produce a wine which their consumer base wants to drink, and good luck to them. That's what they do. Whereas and a lot of French producers are very interventionist, particularly in Bordeaux, less so in Burgundy. And there are people who champion minimal intervention all over the world, actually. So in the Barossa Valley, that younger artisan movement that I mentioned, they would generally lean towards minimal intervention. They might play a little with natural yeasts and cultured yeast, but this guy says that he's used a basket press and so hand-picked and open fermented. So that means it's traditional open vat fermentation. So not cooled. So that means it's a warm ferment. And then basket pressed. So that means it's a very firm pressing, which means you get as much tannin as possible. So in that case, it's a very traditional way of making wine. And I guess the philosophy there is that whatever the grapes have as a flavour this year, this vintage, is what is going to go in the wine. And that's just how it's going to be. And I won't play too much with any of the things I could do. I think within reason, to make sure that they're going to get the type of wine they want, they'll decide year in, year out whether to intervene a little bit, maybe. There's certainly producers that won't intervene at all, even if they're going to have a lesser quality in some years, and they just stick to their philosophy. But the question of how much to intervene and a little bit or maybe a few things, or is a huge question. One of the big arguments, and it's a French argument, although Australian producers use it as well, is to say that if you do certain very careful, intelligent interventions, so you're selective what you do, that intervention will bring the flavour out more of the vineyard. So therefore, you're actually doing more to express the terroir flavour of your raw material. And so, you know, where, say, for example, a Burgundy winemaker, a French Burgundy winemaker will often say, well, I am just the guardian of this magnificent vineyard, and I have tiny intervention. The wine makes itself. I'm just the custodian of getting the grapes through the winemaking into the bottle to let the vineyard express itself. And you say, okay, well, that's really good. What do you do? And they say, well, we pick at night and we cold soak in cold closed containers with carbon dioxide. And then we warm it up and the natural yeast finishes off. We put whole bunches in, so we leave the stalks in. Then we do a racking. If fermentation doesn't finish off in some years because there's too much tannin, we warm the vat at the end to get fermentation to finish. We may even finish fermentation in the barrel. We do barrel roll to control the amount of oak pickup, although we generally use old oak. We deliberately warm the barrels at the end of that season to make sure we get a malolactic fermentation to soften the acidity. Although now with global warming, we're stopping that. So we keep it cold so we don't get a malolactic fermentation to keep the acidity high. And then we settle and bottle under cold bottling conditions. And you go, so really you're not doing any intervention at all. So the argument is what we're doing is bringing out the flavour best of the vineyard. So that argument rages on that a lot of those winemaking decisions are part of the terroir. Terroir does not stop at the doors of the winery. So the grapes come in from the vineyard. They certainly have a certain flavour on them, but it's pretty much agreed that terroir continues with decisions in the winery, which have got to be sympathetic to whatever you've got. And that means that the clever winemakers will change their winemaking from one vintage to another to suit their conditions. They don't just make the wine the same way year in, year out, which used to be the case, by the way, in France, but it's no longer the case, certainly at the high end. You know, there's decisions being made to try and get the best. So the argument about intervention and whether it belongs or not and how much intervention is a big thing. I guess, filtration is probably considered too far. It depends. If you've had a fault creep in on your wine, then maybe you've got to do some filtration. And the big one is how much preservative, and do you add it at the crusher? So if the grapes come in and you've had a humid end to the season and the grapes are covered in fungus, and you know you're going to get botrytis, and then later on you'll probably get Brettanomyces breakout. Of course you'll add sulfur at the crusher, and the French do, the Australians do too. In a good year, you don't have to. And it provided your winemaking equipment's all pretty clean, you should get through vintage okay. So yeah, it's one of those subjects about intervention as a subject that is spoken about endlessly. And there's a lot of bullshit talked about it too, I can tell you. So that's just the way it is.
I must ask you, Andrew, has Rudolf Steiner had an influence on any of this?
Well, indeed. Yes. And
the spirituality of the vineyard.
You could keep talking about intervention. See, because with organic wine, certified organic, you're allowed certain interventions. With a biodynamic wine, you're not allowed quite as many, although you have other processes, you know, the cow's horn all that sort of stuff. So yes, absolutely, the spiritual dimension, Ken. So, and there's some pretty good biodynamical wine around. So there we are. Let's try wine number 3, which is particularly interesting. This is the biggest red. So now we're on to, it's La Nerthe. It's labelled Côte du Rhone. But as I said earlier on, it's just across a laneway from Châteauneuf du Pape. And in fact, this same producer has got a lot of Châteauneuf du Pape and is a pretty famous Châteauneuf du Pape producer. So we're in the southern Rhone now. The majority grape is Grenache, but there's also a lot of what they call Syrah, obviously, we call Shiraz. And the back label refers to that and says that the wine is dominated by Grenache, Syrah, and Mourvèdre, which is a third variety, which adds a lot of colour to it. When you see the colour of the wine, it's not quite as crimson as the Australian wines and on the Argentinian wine, a little bit bricky red. And on the aroma, very pleasant aroma, certainly a spicy sort of light plummy sort of aroma. And to taste, quite full-bodied, but this time there's quite a bit of tannin. So think of a cup of tea made with 2 tea bags, and then you add quite a bit of sugar to it. So you've got sweet fruitiness, but you've got a really grippy dryness as well. And that's what that wine has. That grippy extra tannin is a product of warmer ferment, and then during fermentation, much more maceration, much more squashing of the grapes. And there's various ways you can do the squashing. You can plunge it a lot because the cap of grapes tends to float to the surface. You can pump it over. That's where you a pump sucks wine out of the bottom and squirts it under pressure in the top and breaks up the cap of grapes, and you circulate the wine. That can work very well early in fermentation when the yeasts are very active, but it's not very good at the end of fermentation because you're oxidizing the wine then, and you don't want to do that. So when the yeasts are very active, the yeasts scavenge up all the oxygen anyway, so it doesn't matter if you're introducing oxygen. So if you're going to do a big pump over, normally the pumping over is done very forcibly at the beginning of fermentation, then you stop it halfway through. So this wine would be warm ferment with pumping over initially and plunging to get all that tannin. And you can actually smell the Grenache. There's quite a red fruits Grenache. I think it's a very Grenache dominant spicy wine. Now, Grenache itself doesn't have that much tannin, doesn't have that much color either, which is probably a clue to this color here. But certainly if you have a big proportion of Shiraz will give you the tannin all right. And I think that's what's happened here. Mourvèdre is moderately tannic, but good color. And it has perfume and so on to it, and a softness. So that wine there's got, I think, quite interesting flavors. What's the quality like? So a sip and an evaluation of the persistence. It's certainly palate coating. You can taste that furry, powdery dryness, and the so-called finish of the wine. The wine taste is fading now, and of course the remnant taste that you have left behind, the finish, is that tannin. I can still taste that tannin a bit now. So it's certainly lingering on more than the other wines. Tannins soften with bottle age, and tannin can be a pretty good natural preservative, especially if there's natural acidity there as well. The two of them combine. So acid and tannin reinforce each other to give you a very savoury character, which this wine's got. It's from the 2019 vintage, which was a coolish, not too cold, not bad year actually, 2019. I think that's pretty good wine. It's got some underlying acidity too. So I think that wine will bottle age exceedingly well for, well, I mean, knowing me, I'd be saying 5 years because I like them on the younger side. But I know a lot of people would regard a Chateau Neuf du Pape as a proposition for quite long aging. And I've tasted some quite old Chateau Neuf du Pape, and they light and brown and copper in colour, and they've lost their perfume, but they still have an all-round softness and a bit of punch to them. So they do age very nicely. But I'd love to see that in 5 years' time, and I'll probably buy a few bottles for myself just to sort of look, because I think that's pretty good wine. In terms of winter warmer, it certainly ticks all the boxes. It's it's quite a big red. It's got a lot of tannin. It's overall pretty good quality, and it's got that tannin level. So even though it's very tannic, I think you can see that if that's softened, it would be it'd be an interesting wine for a period of time. It's interesting to go backwards after you've looked at that and your palate's acclimatized to all that tannin.
Before you go backwards too much,
yeah,
can I ask you a question about tannin?
Yeah.
When you say tannin softens, it's polymerizing, isn't
Yes.
it? And I was thinking about a bottle of vintage port I had recently, and the sediment, and there was a very, very considerable amount, like a dessert spoon of sediment in the bottom, was quite crunchy, as well as having some what I would call filmy tannin. So would I be correct in saying that when tannin polymerizes, it's producing a sort of a tissue paper-like film, whereas the crunchy bit, that's not tannin. Is that tartaric acid or something? Or
yeah, I think it probably is. The crunchy feel is probably
right. So the sediment in a good old bottle of port is a mixture of tannin and tartaric acid.
Yeah, it is. And well, it goes to the cream of tartar. It actually goes to that.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So part two of the question is this. Does it really matter if that gets mixed into the wine? Because the tartaric acid, A, is more or less tasteless, and B, sinks to the bottom very quickly, so it doesn't matter. And B, the filmy tannins don't really mix back in with the wine unless you really shake it around. So does it really matter if you pour a bit of sediment into the glass? It doesn't seem to me.
No, I think the only problem with sediment is the fact that, if you get it in your mouth, it's not very pleasant. But
yeah, sure. No, I've tried.
There's plenty of flavour. There's plenty of flavour in it. Yeah. And
one of the reasons I ask that, because I love watching some of these sort of tosser type videos from the UK mob of how to decant a bottle of wine against a candle and all the rest of it. I thought, God Almighty, what a bunch of losers.
Well, yeah. I think there's certainly one of the big things about, and I guess it was very much an Australian thing, was to achieve brightness in wine.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Not cloudiness. So I think a lot of people do expect brightness. And of course, if you want to get brightness on an old bottle of red, or in your case, a bottle of port, I mean, you do have to do some settling and sort of maybe.
Oh, sure. Yeah, but I mean, obviously you pour it reasonably carefully and you're not going to get sediment. But if you're trying to get the last little bit out of your $200 bottle of port, it doesn't really matter if you pour a bit of sediment into it.
No, it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. Yeah. That's right. And you can use it.
People make such a fuss about decanting it, though.
Yeah. Well, you can actually pour it through very fine gauze, which means the very, very fine sediment that gets in, which is almost like chalk powder type size, if it kind of was in there and you take it wouldn't matter. It would just.
But there isn't really any fine sediment anyway. It's all
Yep. No, agreed. Yep.
Part of the myth.
What? Sorry, Ken.
Part of the myth.
Oh, well, yeah. Table theatre. People love table theatre.
Oh, look, I love table theatre, but it's nice. It's nice to know what the real science behind it is.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. So going backwards after that wine is interesting. So back to the Barossa Valley, and you can see it is particularly scented. It's very perfumed raspberries, almost like the raspberry jube confectionery, and compared to the Rhone wine, it's a soft, very juicy wine, and Certainly doesn't have the persistence, but it's pretty good, pretty good. And back to the Malbec, it's very nice aroma. It does have that fruit cake, Christmas cake, fruit sort of Christmas pudding sort of smell. And it's also quite full-bodied. It's got a degree of tannin now. It's probably a little firmer finishing than the Barossa Shiraz. You can sort of weigh them up on persistence levels for the overall quality. And, if you were in some sort of wine competition, you'd have to give them points and pick the highest wine. And how do you do that when they're all pretty good? So you just go on persistence and say, well, the best persistence here is the French one. And it's pretty young, but it's certainly got the persistence. And it'd be lovely to see in a few years. The other two, I think, drinking well on the young side. Not to say you wouldn't serve them over the next few years, but not any particular period of time. So there we are with the, we don't quite have the fire going here in Brisbane. We've been up to the winery a couple of times and it's been below zero up there over the last few weeks. So that's where you definitely have the fire going, and you'll be having wines like this, that's for sure. But not that cold here. But I don't know how it is. How's the weather in Newcastle? Amy and Todd, are you freezing there, or is it not too bad?
It's not too bad. I think we've had about 6 overnight, sort of. That's 16, 17 during the day. So, yeah, it's okay. I was going to ask you about the Argentinian. We know nothing about Argentinian.
Who does?
Yeah. So I was a little bit interested to hear a little bit more about that. What's their? I mean, what are they famous for?
Well, in reds, Malbec. Yeah, it's now pretty much become their national variety. They do other things too, but they've got an array of wine regions, Argentina, but their so-called mountain regions, and Mendoza's their best known, are pretty high altitude and, quite famous for producing Malbec. They make a lot of Chardonnay as well. Argentinian Chardonnays around, and tends to be a bigger, fruitier, more alcoholic, more phenolic style than what we would be used to in Australia. But there's a lot of it about. It's a lot in UK supermarkets as well. Certainly in the UK, buying inexpensive wine, a lot of people would go, if you wanted a day-to-day soft red, people usually choose Rioja or Spanish wine. But if you want a big red and you don't know much about wine, you don't want to spend too much, then Argentinian Malbec fits that spot. If you want to spend a little more and go to France, there's a district called Madaran, which is also where there's which is in Languedoc, and Madaran makes a big tannic red, and there's a number of the different Tanat and other big reds, and there's Malbec there too. And you can get quite big reds that are not too expensive. So Argentinian Malbec sort of occupies a role. Actually, I've heard this a little bit in Australia too, where people looking for a big red sort of know about Argentinian Malbec and seek it out. It's as being bigger than what you traditionally get out of an Australian red. I'm not sure about that. I think you can get really big Australian reds too, particularly if you go for some of those Robert Parker style Barossa Valley Shirazes. I mean, they're 15, 16%, some of them, and massive wines.
Well, I was going to say as well, Todd's mum recently found in her cellar, because Todd's dad was a big red drinker, he passed away 10 years ago, she found a Lindeman's 1990 Coonawarra Cabernet Sauvignon.
The sesquicentenary, cellared nicely. So.
Yeah.
1990, yeah.
Yeah, and we looked it up, and it recently went for auction at about 1.7K apparently.
Oh,
So-
That'd be right. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. So I don't know whether or not we should.
No, we'll drink it.
Yeah, drink it. Yeah, I don't think.
Oh no, 19. So Lindemans was was founded in the Hunter Valley as a Hunter Valley region, Hunter Valley
was it?
producer by.
Oh, I didn't even know it was in the Hunter Valley.
No. That's where it was founded. So it was a doctor,
Oh.
another doctor, Henry Lindemann was a doctor who boutique, and then I think his family or successors then also bought vineyards in Coonawarra, which is part of South Australia, and so probably the Lindemans Hunter River wines were very famous, and there was Shiraz and Semillon, and they used to call the Semillon Chablis or Burgundy or White Burgundy or Riesling. They used to call it Hunter River Riesling, and it was always made of Semillon, and then they used to call the Shiraz Hunter River Burgundy, even though it was made of Shiraz. And then they had really good vineyards in Coonawarra. And for a while there, for a long time, Lindemans made some very, very famous wines in Coonawarra. They had a succession of individual vineyard wines, and they had wine names like Lindemans St. George, Limestone Hill, Limestone Hill, and Pyrrhus was another, Lindemans Pyrrhus, and there was another one. Anyway, now Lindemans was sort of bought by South Corp, who owned Penfolds at the time, and Lindemans got sort of sucked into the Penfolds family. And at about that time, the Rhone vineyards in Coonawarra came up for sale, and Lindemans bought those, but kept the name Rhone, although a lot of the Rhone vineyards went into Lindemans. Now the Lindemans name is not being used, and all those vineyards in Coonawarra pretty much goes into other, it's all Treasury estates now, Treasury wine estates. So they bring out an array of Coonawarra wines. And every now and then someone says, oh, this is the old Lindemans St. George vineyard, or so it's quite famous and historic. So the wine you've got would be one of their very best batches, and the wine would be elegant and would have had quite good acidity. 1990 was a really great year, so it would have lasted pretty well.
So is that too old though, like 1990, to drink it now? Would it be
old,
too?
Yeah. If the corks held, it'll be very interesting to try.
Depends crucially on the cellar conditions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Was it a cool cellar or not?
Yeah, it was quite a cool. I mean, Dad did have a quite cool cellar set up. He had it was sort of under the ground here in Newcastle, and you had a temperature and humidity sensor and kept it quite.
It'll probably be okay, I guess.
Too. It was in like a
commemorative box.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.